any distraction or soothing sensation you place over the top kind of disguises what you're opening to. So that's why I when I'm doing a meditation group, there's no music and there's no storytelling. There's just, observe the body, look at the sensations, stillness, and then eventually, of course, that gets let go of. But as a tool for health, it's still nice to just focus on the breath sometimes if the mind is moving around. It's quite interesting in meditation. It's nice to get to the place where, in deep meditation, where you can feel the very slight movement of thought. So there's stillness, and you can actually observe when the mind is just like contracting and moving. It's quite, and it's so apparent. You just notice the shifting mind starting to think again in a certain direction. And it's almost like there's a balance between just being okay with that, not trying to affect it, and observing it. It's quite an interesting thing, but it's quite funny how compulsive the mind is to just almost compulsively contract and move in a direction of thought. So that in itself could be a form of could be a whole meditation, just watching. But I find as John that I have to get to a point of a very quiet mind where everything's calmed down before I can even notice that shifting of the it's like a contraction of muscle. It's in the mind, just movement.
Yeah. I get it. I recognize what you say. Yeah.
And is your mind quieter?
It's definitely quieter because the participation in the loop of thoughts doesn't get perpetuated, but there's so much residual character of conditioning, habitual mind movement, that it's not completely still. Here anyway, this is this character, how this one's turned out at this stage, and it's constantly changing, as I always say. But definitely quieter than the life before. But it doesn't need to be quieter anyway. It just needs to be understood that all of that stuff that's happening is just the vibrance. It's just the bright expression of human being. It doesn't need to be quiet. It's just part of the exploration, part of the range of notes, if you like, in the human scale. Could be when it's deep in meditation, there's quiet, and these subtle shifts can be observed. But sometimes there wants to be, a symphony, and that'll appear as well. But that's the beauty. That's the beauty of being a human being. I really, as I've always said in the last while, it's just so much. There's so much to be embraced in being a human being. That's much more allowed now. So if there's noise, then there's noise, and it's interesting. It's texture and tint of life. It's just that it's not. When the worry of the separate self or the concern of the separate self kicks in through habit in the old conditioning, that's immediately seen as doing that. And because it's just seen as, oh yeah, it does that, thinking does that, that's okay. Then that just just drops away very quickly. Whereas earlier, before, it would have been ruminated on. And rumination still happens, by the way, but it's just seen as this mind game following itself down a trail, and then it just dissolves. It just drops away quite quickly because there's nothing feeding it, because the identity's just thoughts. I talk a lot about that. And it's one of the most sort of pertinent points of this discussion is, everyone says, well, how does that shift happen? How does that perspective shift happen? And that's, in a way, it just happens in this whole thing unwinding, of course. It's like the innate intelligence sees itself through the human condition. So that's why it's so non-doable from the human separate self perspective. It's not that's going to do it. It's the intelligence of this, everything, which is expressing through humanity, somehow interacting and triggering itself and seeing itself in that play, which is kind of a vague way of understanding it, but that's kind of the understanding that happened here. And
one wonders why it doesn't have that interest in coming out in every human being. Why does it only seem to come out in some lucky ones? Why? It's weird to me.
I don't understand how it doesn't get seen by everybody now. It's just so... It's fairly obvious, but just tangled up in thoughts. There's nothing to it, really. It's just prior to thoughts. It's just prior to all the rest of the noise. And I don't know, there's sort of peace either way now. It's okay if it's not seen, and it's okay if it is seen. Nothing really matters like that, except when it mattered to the person that was so caught up in the story. When you said confidence, and I have confidence to have these meetings and talk about it, it doesn't feel like that. That one went clang, because it's like, hadn't really seen it that way. It's more that confidence is another security for the identified separate self-entity to cling to. And that's also seen as, you can just open that. And then this just does what it does in a sort of a true way. It's a different way of confidence. It's like life has confidence in itself. It's like life will flow, as opposed to there's confidence in the separate self, or there's not confidence and then there's threat. So that idea, I'd almost let that word go. I use it. I've used it recently. You've just reminded me that it's not really confidence, because confidence feels like this identified idea, story, clinging to something. And then the other thing, which I can't really describe, but I'm going to try to, is that there is sort of a trust when the identified mind, or the ego, or whatever you want to call it, learns to trust, or have, you can use it this way, have confidence to not know what's going to happen, is almost part of the play of letting go. That opening or letting go, or it's not the individual who sees its nature. The individual is seen as nature or life by itself, by the whole. And it's what we don't really know how much, as I said, we don't really know whether this whole intelligence, it's probably happening much broader than the human body. We just don't know. It's a filtration that's happening, an intensification, a node of it as a human intellect working itself out, which is why it identifies. And then when that blends back into the whole, just interacting as a human being as well, that seems to be the flow, the openness. And so it's already doing it. It's always doing it. It always has been doing it. It's just interacting now. This is just energy interacting. It is just energy interacting. And we just take forms that we take as literal separation. It's not separate. None of this is separate. None of it is separate. And even that feels like a dogma. It doesn't matter. It's just an idea that it's separate. We're just looking into that. But and so when this says it's not separate, it's driving it home. But it doesn't need to be that forcefully conceptualized. It doesn't really. It's just it's creating tension in the minds here, so that it's looked at because it feels compelled to do so. But whatever. So, it's not wrong, but it's just noticed as I'm speaking. I'm noticing, whenever there's force, it's not needed, but perhaps it has some use. It's a tool, basically. This human being, as I said before, the self structure is still a tool to help itself release, just like suffering can be a gift to help it for this to be seeing itself, seeing its suffering, seeing where it's not right, seeing what needs to be healed, perhaps. Once again, those words need, clang, that's that note that I didn't mean to hit. That was that off note. That need word was that off note. Just like it's the symphony's always going on, and occasionally some bad notes or some unharmonious notes will clang. It's just it's what happens. But they're seen as that. And then it's like, okay. And that smooths itself out and comes back into harmony. The suffering creates the energy for change as well. So you don't want it, you don't like it. But in hindsight, it's like, oh, that wouldn't have changed without that huge amount of energy, which was the suffering, to change. The intellect's good to soften the structure. Life might soften the structure, but ultimately the opening of this intelligence with itself, this unknowable openness, which is all what we are, this nature, life expressing, this one interactive energy expressing. Then the thinking mind, I think, the analytical mind, came back in and started playing in that with the new plasticine, if you know what I mean. The blank canvas started to be played with the intellect, with a completely different hands to remold the ideas and stories, which are then expressed this way, which also help itself rewire itself. The conditioning gets massaged by those new hands in a different way with the new canvas or new putty or new plasticine, whatever you want to call it, new Play-Doh of life, ideas, energy, thought, experience, all gets reconfigured, and all of that old conditioning kind of gets changed as well in that new exploration. But that's where the intellect comes back in with a different perspective and goes, ooh, look at the depth and complexity of this. This is amazing. But there's kind of there was a gap between the crystalline ego structure, analytical mind, the breakdown of that, the opening, which wasn't to do with the mind. It was more trusting and opening, and this wholeness, intelligently understanding itself. And then the intellect comes back in and plays in that new space from a completely different perspective, which is just a new texture. It's like a new chapter evolving, and that whatever capacity the intellect has to express it or play in it, then interacts in the whole again. So it's like a metamorphosis. It was like a metamorphosis, and now the new way of playing in this is happening, but not from a place of intellect, from a place of innate okayness with this being what it is, and also using whatever tools it has experienced in this human body to then play in it, investigate it, express it, interact with it. And it's just so different, so much more passionate and vibrant this way